Welcome to EB5 Investment Voice, where attorney insights intersects with immigration investments. If you are a foreign investor, domestic fund manager, or enterprising entrepreneur and want to get the most out of the EB5 program, you have come to the right place. I'm Mark Deal, and I'll be your co-host on this journey. I'm joined by your host, Mona Shaw, and other attorneys at Mona Shaw & Associates, as well as immigration leaders from around the world. So let's get into EB5 Investment Voice. You know, Mona, in the 4 years that we've been doing this show, from time to time, we've talked about the project documents and PPMs and what to put in some of this documentation. Well, now we live in a post-regulation change EB5 environment, so it's probably good to revisit some of those and talk about the changes to the project documents.
Oh, yes, absolutely, Mark, because project documents and the law don't stay static. I would say that this is a very dynamic industry. We've had umpteen changes in the last 4 years, and many of these changes are just arbitrary. We would have a stakeholders meeting, and suddenly USCIS would randomly pick up a topic and tell us that they're changing something huge, like the designation for the geographic designations and stuff. But the bottom line is we have to keep revisiting it, unfortunately. Interestingly, though, we've had a number of questions, we've had a number of queries asking us to clarify what's going on with admin fees. So rather than go talk about admin fees, I thought the best thing is let's get a real expert in the field in, someone who really understands this area.
Yeah, let's do that, Mona. And spoiler alert, it's not me. Today on the show, we welcome Ronald Fieldstone. Ronnie is not only a partner of Saul, Ewing, Arnstein, and Lair, he's also the chair of their Global Immigration and Foreign Investment Practice. And that's a big role at a big firm. They boast locations from Minneapolis to Miami in industries ranging from construction to cannabis. He represents both developers and regional centers in EB5 matters, currently handling more than 350 EB5 projects with a combined capital raise in excess of $8 billion. Ronnie, I know we had you on about 6 months ago, so welcome back to EB5 Investment Voice.
Nice to be here.
Thanks, Ronnie. Ronnie, I'm going to jump straight into it. Admin fees. Documents are all over the place right now on admin fees. Let's just take a step back, though, and explain to our listeners what exactly are administrative fees or management fees, as we've often heard them, and what are they supposed to be used for?
Admin fees have been around since day one when I got involved in EB5 in 2009. Right. And that's basically an upfront fee that's paid by the investor, or usually paid by the investor almost always, to cover various costs. Traditionally, that was offering costs, regional center costs, related costs, and that was the concept of it. But admin fees have become a profit center for both regional centers and marketing agents. So basically, when you have an EB5 offering, you have a regional center sponsorship. Most regional centers, as you know, Mona, receive some part of the admin fee to compensate for their maintenance of the regional center and making sure the investor complies with EB5 guidelines. And usually it's a per investor fee. It doesn't have to be, but it's very common it's a per investor fee. The reason for that is the more investors, the more work to be done. So it's usually a set amount per investor that comes out of the admin fee, goes to the regional center. The balance of the admin fee normally goes to the marketing agent. If there is no marketing agent, then the admin fee can be retained by the regional center or the sponsor. The sponsor may not be the regional center. The sponsor could be a separate party that forms the EB5 company and serves as a general partner manager of that company. That would be a sponsor. So the retention of the admin fee would be, under SEC rules, should be exempt from broker-dealer regulation because it's a fee and there's no commission, as long as there's no commission paid to an unlicensed party in connection with the retention of the fee.
But Ron, we've often discussed this with people who are using, people who are putting their own project together and they're getting admin fee from the investors. We have advised them that the admin fee can only be used for project-related expenses, and the SEC do look at that.
Well, the SEC is looking, and I've been involved in several SEC investigations, yes, our firm has. So I'm very familiar with the when the notice comes of what the SEC is looking for, you get used to it. It's pretty standard.
Right.
An admin fee is a form of a commission to some degree in a form of an expense payment. If the regional center retains an admin fee, that's generally not considered a commission. That's considered a fee for services rendered. If the general partner manager retains a fee, that's no different than a general partner of a non-EB5 transaction receiving a general partner fee. That's exempt from broker-dealer regulation if the sponsor keeps the fee. There's a specific section that exempts that fee as what's called an issuer exemption. It's under the broker-dealer rules. The only tricky part of the admin fee is when a portion of the admin fee is paid to a third-party marketing agent.
Right.
If that happens, that's where you get into issues. If the marketing agent is offshore and all of the selling activities have taken place offshore, which is fairly typical in the industry, substantially, at least historically, substantially all EB5 funds were raised offshore by offshore agents. And as long as they maintained their presence offshore and did the marketing offshore and had no U.S. presence in their marketing activities, that under Regulation S, that's called a Reg S offering, there is no BD broker-dealer issues because the SEC does not regulate offshore sales from a broker-dealer standpoint. If there's presence in the United States, we call where the applicant or the investor becomes what we call a U.S. person. A U.S. person doesn't mean they're a resident, it means they were sold in the jurisdiction of the United States or through the instrumentality of U.S. commerce. For instance, if there's an investor offshore and you call the investor on the phone and sell them the investment or email them the documents and they sign and send it back, that's an onshore sale. Even though the investor is offshore, because the marketing activity and the subscription activity was done onshore, that's a U.S. sale. That's perfectly legal if there's no payment of commission. If there's a payment of commission on any onshore sale, whether it's directly involving the United States directly, like the investor is in the United States, or an offshore sale using the instrumentality of commerce, then the commission can only be paid to a licensed broker-dealer, or else the commission is tainted and subject to disgorgement for payment of improper commissions. There's been many cases by the SEC, highly publicized, against various parties, including traditionally immigration attorneys who weren't aware of this issue when they got a referral fee.
We've actually discussed this at length in one of our podcasts.
Yes, so it's an issue. I don't want to beat on it, but the fact is, when you mention the admin fee, you got to be careful.
Exactly.
Follow the rules very carefully and document when you pay a commission, document the basis of the commission and making sure that it's done properly. If it's paid to a licensed broker-dealer in the United States, not an issue, because that's permissible. So those are and it can be retained as an issuer exemption or paid to an offshore agent as an offshore sale. Those are really the issues. So that's the issue of the admin fee.
So now we're looking at the cost. So people have said, it should be 10% of the offering. And there's no written rule anywhere that it has to be 10%, 5%, 20% or whatever. But the norm has been that when it was 500,000, the admin fee was usually in the range of 50,000.
Correct. And matter of fact, when I started practicing, the admin fee started at 35,000, just for information's sake. And it kept going up to 40, 45, 50.
I remember when it was 25,000.
Okay, there you go. You're older than me. I don't think you are. So basically, what's going on today is very interesting. The admin fee has become a profit center. And the more competition for EB5 funds, the higher the admin fee goes. Because if you have agents and you're competing to get their money for their investors, the agents are now incentivized to make sure the admin fee is higher. Now, the investors are paying the admin fee, but sometimes developers will subsidize a portion of the admin fee as a give back. And that happens sometimes where developers give incentives to agents and pay some of the admin fee to get the amount up. But the admin fee has traditionally, until I'd say a year or 2 years ago, been about $50,000, 10% of 500. Now that you have the new regulations, the industry is wide open. Do you charge 10% of 900,000? The answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is because it's already a $900,000 investment. The investor, you're selling the same investor. Understand, it's the same sale. You're doing the same amount of work to get a 900.
Ronnie, I'll have to interrupt you here because I agree that, it's a lot of money, 90,000. However, some markets, for example, the Korean markets, the Korean agents are coming down with, we want 90,000 admin fee and we want this.
Well, my guesstimate is, from what I've seen so far, and I'll tell you the reason why, I'm seeing a range of 60 to 80. I'm seeing people go up to 60 because that's a compromise, which is very common. I've seen 80. I'm seeing a push to 80 because they're able to get it. I was unaware of 90, but I'm not surprised. I mean, I'm not saying it's perfectly legal, but let's understand the difference between a 5 and a 9. And a $500,000 investment, the agents get a back-end percentage. That's normal in the industry. Yeah. Whatever the percentage is, 2%, 3%, 4%, they get a back-end. Now they're getting the same back-end percentage on 900,000, not 500. Think of the economics to the agent on the back end, how more accretive it is and profitable for the same sale. So they really don't necessarily need to grab a much higher admin fee, but if they can get it, they get it. Maybe they give the investor more money going forward. And that could be the reason why the admin fee may be higher, because maybe they say, I want to charge a higher admin fee, but the investor will get a higher return on their money. That's another structure issue when you have a $900,000 investment of how to handle it.
Ron, again, the back-end fee I have seen is going out. The back-end fee was there when you dealt with China, when you deal with Vietnam, or when you deal with Korea. There's no back-end fee for the rest of the world. And when you deal with countries like India, it's just not heard of. And on top of that, which I'm really glad to see, you can see there are big regional centers out there like CMB, like Civitas, who are saying no to back-end points completely. And once you start seeing the bigger regional centers saying that, it is starting to become the norm. And I'm really happy to see that.
No, that's a change. And then if you don't have a back-end fee, then the increased admin fee makes sense. But I am seeing, from my experience, that agents want to get an upfront additional payment over the admin fee. They want a front-end load payment from the developer to take into account the fact that the developer is receiving this very inexpensive back-end money for an extended period of time. But we are seeing transactions where the back-end fee is still there, and the agents are marketing in the applicable countries you mentioned, but they have a whole force of people on the ground in various non-retrogress countries, plus India. India is still vibrant. It's still active.
Yeah.
China is not active. I don't know if Vietnam today is very active, but India is still very active from my experience.
Yeah.
But clearly the other countries you mentioned are very active because they're not retrogress. So I think this is a moving target. I think we're going to see what happens in the industry, but I'm aware of a range of fees being paid. And you're right, in many areas, the agent, and especially in Latin America, may just get the upfront fee and no back-end fee. And sometimes the developer may want to, where there's multiple parties, a developer who's maybe a co-manager or the regional center that's sponsoring the program may want to keep a back-end fee for themselves. So I'm not suggesting that the back-end fee has gone away. In some cases, yes. In other cases, no. So I wouldn't say that's a rule of thumb. I think that's an optional situation today. And the other issue is, are investors satisfied getting a very small return on a $900,000 investment? Like historically, before the 900, you were looking at a quarter of a point, a half a point, maybe a point. Now we're seeing a pressure at a $900,000 investment to increase the interest, the rate of return to the investor directly.
Right.
And if it extends beyond a certain period of time, we're seeing that interest increase to reward the investor for an extended, like for instance, if the loan is 5 years with 2 1-year renewal options, we're seeing an interest rate X, and then in the first renewal term, X plus 1, second renewal term, X plus 2. So we're seeing an incentive to pay investors a higher return if their investment stays out a longer period of time.
We were seeing that actually even in the 500. And also we noticed in the 500 that right at the end, I would say the last year, we got some totally crazy interest ranges. There were some projects, a lot of projects at 1%, perhaps at 2%. And then there were some projects at 6%, 8%. Granted, they were giving common equity, but they were giving crazy high interest rates, which made you wonder how the whole mathematics was going to work.
Well, let me comment on that because we've done both ways. It used to be almost all EB5 programs were loan models with a set interest rate. lately we're seeing, especially at 900,000, we're seeing preferred equity or common equity. If a developer does a preferred equity or common equity and pays 6 or 7%, that's still cheap compared to what the market would be if it was normal equity funding. Because a normal equity investor who takes a risk of the project that is not a lender would demand more than a 6 or 7% return on providing seed capital for a project. So really, when you start comparing the preferred rate to the normal equity return of a U.S. type investor or a normal private equity investor, that's where the bridge is. It's still less expensive. And we're seeing two types of structures. One is a preferred equity where you just get a fixed return. So it's a little like a loan, but you're subordinated to all other debt. And there's no pressure if you don't pay it because you can't foreclose on a preferred equity investment. And we're seeing common equity where they get a preferred return, but they don't get a priority return of their money and they participate in profit.
And that's much more risky, I would say.
It's risky, but there's a higher reward. So I take the position, an aside comment, that at the non-TEA level of $1.8 million, one would say there's no market because it's just nobody's going to spend $1.8 million. The only exception to that in my dealings with developers and agents, the only exception to that is if you offer a straight private equity investment of a pref return and a participation in profits, the investor is now making what I could be more of a standard non-EB5 equity investment. That today is probably the only market that's viable in $1.8 million.
I agree. Ron, in addition to the changes in the admin fees, what are you now seeing in the marketplace? Bearing in mind that we are really only into the first month, the only real first month of marketing at this new level.
Actually, yes and no. Let me explain why. We had clients that actually planned on not releasing their documents until November 21st. They had their documents prepared as if the regs had taken place. So the regs are now adopted as of the 21st, and they went to market soft sell at the late November, December, even though it's a slow season. And then, of course, a lot of people aren't working, but they started soft selling, getting their agents or contacts or direct investors interested, because it was always assumed that in a TEA project, after November 21st, all of the old would you agree, Mona? A majority of the old TEA projects went away. Because a majority of the old TEA projects, would not qualify.
Right, but I would say a lot of the older ones are still struggling and trying to find ways, which we'll discuss in a few moments.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're at $1.8 million, you're kind of out of business. So if you raise some of your money and you're now at $1.8 million, you're pretty well out of business. If you're at 900, if you were at 5 and went to 9, that's marketable because the market's 9. If you didn't hit the market, you waited because everybody was going in at 5. There was no use going in with a new deal and crowding the market at 5, then 9 at the last minute. So people waited saying, okay, I got a project that's a TEA. It's a really good project. I'm going to hit the market right after the regs become effective because I'll be one of the first in loop on new projects that are brand new because 900 becomes the minimum and that becomes your standard. Because right now, 900 is a standard, like 500 used to be. So we're seeing projects that were prepared to hit the market early. And I agree with you. Most people went to sleep for the rest of the year. In January, most people are waking up and the market's kind of kicking back in. And so you're correct. We're starting to see TEA projects that are being undertaken. My impression is not many of them. And the industry is very selective. There is a market for $900,000, but there's a lot of competition as well. And so I believe that the projects that are very viable, what I mean by very viable, strong developer, strong economics, good geography, good track record.
A better project.
Better. The investors are going to be more selective at 900 than they were at 5. For a lot of us, they're making a much bigger commitment. They're going to look much more carefully at the transaction, the structure, and the safety factor of whether they're going to get their money back, understanding that they're now investing $900,000 to generally not make much of a return on their money, with the exceptions, as you mentioned, that some developers are allowing a higher preferred return or a higher interest rate to try to attract investors, especially if there's no back end.
Here's the issue, Ronnie. We have a number of people who didn't get their raise or who need more, and they are trying to squeeze their projects somehow or another within a TEA. they're coming, they need their documents redone, etc. The first thing is how, if they're not in a TEA, can one get them into a TEA? Is it possible to just have an operations in a TEA and somehow or another connect that with their project, the rest of their project, which is in a non-TEA?
That's a good question. And now you're talking, it's very technical. You remind me of opportunity zones, the way opportunity zones work. It's the same concept. I mean, a TEA is a TEA. It's a defined term. It's a donut. We all know what the donut is now. It's a census tract and adjacent. Right. So it is what it is. It's black and white. And that's another issue, by the way. TEA determinations, you're no longer getting the sign off up front. And when you go to your economist, there's multiple models you could use to determine your unemployment rate, to determine how the donut works. It's not just one model. There's multiple models and different census tract information you use depending upon the year of the unemployment and how you manage it. And it's not clear. So one of the really risk factors is you have unless you're a census tract TEA, then it's pretty easy. You have a risk factor that you don't know if USCIS is going to come back and challenge the economic analysis that was generally done by an economist, because you don't have the state signing off anymore in a TEA. That's gone away.
Oh, yeah, so I've got a point on that one, actually. So there was an article which had been out on the web just last week about the fact that TEAs were based on two data methods, the ACS method and the census share method. Right. So then we went to two or three different economists. And just to quote Kim Atterbury, for example, she's been a former USCIS economist. She stated that USCIS did not restrict the data to these two sources only. So that particular remark is incorrect. She said that USCIS does not identify a particular data set in the NPRM or the final rule, and that basically it isn't a method, it is a data set. And interestingly also, Dave Evans, son of Mike Evans, who any of us who have been out there for a long time used to use Mike Evans all the time, he also stated that, to his understanding, is that either of these two methods would be sufficient, but it doesn't have to pass both. So the census share method is essentially what states have been using all along for designating TEAs. And that method uses ACS data from the census and from the Bureau of Labor statistics data. And that would include things like RIMS2, IMPLAN. Those are never used for TEA assessments.
Well, I'm hearing from the industry that there's some risk that the way the economist does it could be challenged. But I do agree at the end of the day, I think USCIS it would be inappropriate for them to take a position that would be contrary to normal economic analysis. So we're hoping that there's not going to be an issue there. And I've heard the same thing. People are using both methods. They're interchangeable. Either one can work as long as it's backed up. But then you're assuming that USCIS isn't going to change their policy down the road and say, no, this is what we really meant. Because I don't think the regs in detail describe the methodology. They have to approve. They have to approve it. So anytime you're dealing with USCIS, I think we've learned by now, you've got to be careful if it's not clearly defined. And before it was easy. The state certified, you were done. Now the state's not certifying. It's after the fact. When you file your 526, if you get an RFE, now you may have a project that you think's a TEA in the US. You have to prove to USCIS maybe they don't think it's a TEA. That's a risk, but everybody in the industry is taking that risk today. You do the best you can. The issue becomes how close are you? This is where when I talk to the economists, if you're right on the fringe of the 150, that's where it gets tricky. If you're way above the 150, then you don't worry because you got a lot of room. No matter what method you use, it's very clear. But when it gets really close and you use one method that works and the other may not work, that's where the concern comes in. And that's what I'm hearing. I'm not an economist, so it's not for me to dictate that, but I'm hearing that there's some degree of uncertainty on that issue, and it's a priority. Matter of fact, the first thing we say to clients on the new regs is get an economist, confirm you're a TEA, and get a letter confirming in the methodology used. That's the first thing you do.
Straight away, yes, I agree.
And then so when you're updating it, and as a lead into the question, when you're updating your documents, the first thing you do is, are you a TEA? And you must disclose it, and you must prove it. You must say you're a TEA as verified by such and such. The economist, you may want to include a letter from them. It's almost like equivalent to the TEA letter. It's not an opinion letter. It's an economic analysis that they did, that they confirm it's a TEA, and you have to disclose as a risk factor. It's not binding. The economic analysis is not binding on USCIS. They can come back and challenge it. Now, will they? Hopefully not, but there's a risk. So that's step number one. Step number two is you got to look at your documents and
Right.
see what your documents say. Starting a few years ago, all our documents started to say your investment amount's 500, subject to increase based upon legislation or regulation. Because we know the regs were out there for a while. Legislation's been pending, as we know, since June of 2015. Over time, especially when retrogression hit, it became apparent that we got issues here, and they wanted to increase the dollar amounts, and we better allow for it. So if the documents have dealt with it and say, to the extent that the dollar amount increases, the company reserves a right to continue to sell units at the higher dollar amount, and then you probably have a right to modify, or you modify your operating agreement, or in the operating agreement you put, so I have a $500,000 investor and a $900,000 investor, and they're each getting the same interest rate, that the interest rate that gets distributed pro rata.
So Ron, 900 is not divisible by 5 as the way 500 was. How do we show this out in our documents?
A very good question. So what we do is we provide that the offering amount will be increased by the amount necessary to be divisible by the 900,000 extra, since the $500,000 units don't apply to a 9 because they don't divide it. So we basically provide that we provide for the increase accordingly. It's very straightforward.
So we have a project whereby we have a number of $500 investors. We're now bringing in $900,000 investors. We're changing our documents. We're changing the economic report. We're changing the financials. What else do we need to do?
We demand that the developer update the project status. I'm talking about an existing project, because obviously you've been in business for a while. You're going to investors. You're obligated to disclose material information at the time the investment is made. Old investors have the package. Now you're going to new investors. We update the document. So what that means is we usually do a project summary to update the status of the project. As you said, we update the economic report, because now with 5 and 9, you can probably raise a lot more money, because you need less jobs. It's actually proactive. You may want to modify the business plan because the capital stack may change, and you want to address risk factors and deal with the full disclosure of what the regs mean. So we have a whole section on the regs and what's going on. And we think it's appropriate to also disclose that there's pending legislation that could potentially change what the regs say.
Right. And then, increase the amount yet again to $1 million and $1 million one.
Or if the legislation comes in differently, because it's now being heavily negotiated, it could be different.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a chance people talk about the TEA being 800 or the TEA being $1 million. Now, the advantage of investing under the regs is based upon the proposed legislation. You're grandfathered at the 900. If the legislation comes in at $1 million, you are grandfathered at 9. That's an advantage. So we try to describe in the package the new legislation. We try to not be too specific because it's being highly negotiated. It's very hard to rely on new legislation given all the versions that have gone on, and the concern that when and if it's going to happen, we don't know the final stages because it's still being negotiated. But we do disclose that.
Ronnie, you make it sound very straightforward and very simple. And we know it's not so straightforward.
Correct. It's not for the average person. This requires a tremendous degree of, one, history in the industry.
Yeah.
You need to understand the history and what's taken place in the legislation and the regs being pending and what the motivation was of USCIS and what's happening in legislation, what's happening in the industry. I think this is where the professionals involved and the team, I call it, really needs to understand the play for the last several years, and therefore understands the legal issues, the business issues, the securities issues, and the marketing issues. I don't think this is just one skill set of technically complying, because you could do a technically compliant document and it's unsaleable because you haven't described it right or you haven't structured it right. So I think I appreciate the comment. This is not simple, although we as professionals try to simplify it as best we can so people understand it. But it's critical that the professional team have a lot of experience in this industry.
Yeah. And here in PPMs, Ronnie, what we've had to do is not just go back to our original PPM and pad in, but really start afresh. Just start a brand new PPM completely from the beginning.
Yeah, my question to you, Mona, would be, I'm going to shoot you a question as the immigration expert. Okay. If you update the PPM, you can do an addendum, which we do many times, and sometimes we do a brand new one. From an immigration point of view, with pending 526s and then filing new 526s with a new PPM as opposed to an addendum, how does that sit with an immigration filing?
You mean, is it a material change?
You take a higher risk by bringing in a new PPM as opposed to an addendum where the examiner can see what you change and understand. Everybody understands. USC understands. Documents need to change because the law changed. They understand that. That's not an issue.
I would also always recommend that it would be a new offering, even though it was a midstream offering. And in that respect, I think you have a very good argument against any material change. And I really don't see USCS coming back on you on a material change at this point. So whether you do an addendum or whether you do a brand new PPM, I really don't think it makes very much difference as long as the disclosures are very clear.
I agree. It's a lot easier for me to do a new PPM because I don't have to worry about catching all the things that were wrong in the old PPM and need to be updated, because when you do a new one, you put it fresh and you correct it and you update to industry standards based upon where we are today. And you disclose everything that's current, which you wouldn't have done 3-4 years ago when you did the original PPM. And that's a big undertaking, not a small undertaking. It's a major undertaking to do that. And the issue was, will the industry and the developers and the regional centers pay the price to do it right? And we're hoping they will.
Well, I know I've been pretty quiet on this episode, just sitting here, looking back and forth, taking feverish notes. But it sounds like the regs have changed, and therefore the industry has changed. And that's causing rates and fees to also change, which of course should be reflected as a change in the documents. Ronnie, thank you so much for coming back on EB5 Investment Voice.
Thanks, Ronnie. Till our next podcast.
Look forward to it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being with us today on EB5 Investment Voice. The topics presented in this podcast is informational in nature and is not to be taken as specific legal advice. If you have questions on the topics presented in this episode or other investment immigration needs, please contact Mona Shaw & Associates. Mona and her attorney staff can be reached at mshawlaw.com. That's MSHAH law.com. Make sure you don't miss our next episode focusing on a different aspect of the EB5 program by subscribing to the podcast. While you're at it, leave us a rating on iTunes. If you really found this episode valuable, share it with someone else that could benefit from this information. Until then, I'll see you on the next episode of EB5 Investment Voice.